The U-Haul groaned to a halt, its brakes, protesting like a tired beast, finally giving in. Sarah leaned her forehead against the cool passenger window, staring at the house that was now theirs, 412 Maple Street. It wasn't a mansion, far from it. But after years of cramped city apartments and the soul-crushing search for something affordable yet decent, its sturdy brick facade and surprisingly deep backyard felt like winning the lottery. Sunlight, weak but determined for late autumn, glinted off the freshly cleaned windows they'd paid extra for. Ben hopped out, stretching with a groan that echoed the trucks, a wide grin splitting his face. "Home sweet home, babe," he declared, his voice bouncing with an optimism Sarah desperately wanted to share. She climbed out, the crisp air biting her cheeks, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The smell of suburbia, of potential. They'd sacrificed weekends, scrimped on meals out, endured endless viewings of depressing shoeboxes, all for this moment. This was their fresh start, their sanctuary. The house itself, a post-war bungalow, seemed to welcome them with its quiet solidity. The paint was a little faded, the garden overgrown, but it felt solid, peaceful, or so they thought. The unpacking began in a flurry of cardboard boxes, bubble wrap popping like distant gunfire, and the chaotic symphony of furniture scraping across bare floors. Sarah was wrestling a particularly obstinate bookshelf when she felt it, a prickle on the back of her neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She straightened, rubbing her lower back, and turned towards the property line. There, standing like a gnarled statue amidst the skeletal remains of her own neglected rosebushes, was their neighbor. The house next door was a stark, unsettling contrast to theirs, a looming Victorian monstrosity. Its once grand facade, now shrouded in peeling paint, the color of dried blood and neglect. Shutters hung askew, some boarded over completely, and the deep porch seemed to swallow the weak daylight. The woman herself was gaunt, draped in a shapeless, faded floral housecoat that might have been cheerful decades ago. Her iron-gray hair was pulled back severely, emphasizing the sharp angles of her face and the deep, suspicious furrows etched around her mouth and eyes. But it was those eyes that froze Sarah. They weren't just old or tired. They were sharp, unnervingly dark, and fixed on Sarah with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. There was no flicker of welcome, no neighborly curiosity, only a cold, appraising hostility. Ben, lugging a heavy box marked kitchen, fragile, followed Sarah's gaze. "Oh, hey there," he called out, his natural friendliness undeterred. "We're your new neighbors, Ben and Sarah." He took a step towards the low hedge separating the properties, offering a wave. The woman didn't move, didn't blink. Her lips, thin and bloodless, barely parted as she spoke. Her voice was a dry rasp, like dead leaves scraping across concrete, cutting through the cheerful sounds of their moving day with chilling clarity. No noise. The words weren't loud, but they carried an unnerving force. After sundown, no noise, ever. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't offer a name. She simply delivered her decree, her dark eyes boring into them, holding Ben's gaze for a long, uncomfortable moment that stretched into seconds. Then, without another word, she turned with surprising stiffness and vanished into the shadowed maw of her porch, the screen door slamming shut behind her with a sound like a coffin lid closing. Ben lowered his hand, the smile fading from his face, replaced by a look of bewildered unease. Sarah shivered, suddenly feeling the autumn chill seep into her bones despite her sweater. The hopeful sunlight seemed dimmer now, the quiet street feeling less peaceful and more watchful. The decaying Victorian next door wasn't just neglected. It felt like a tomb. and its keeper had just laid down the law of the dead. That first night, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes in the unfamiliar silence of their new bedroom, Sarah was startled awake not by city sirens, but by a new sound, faint, insistent, coming from the shared wall with the Victorian. Scratch, 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 scratch. It was easy, at first, to dismiss it. Just rats in the walls, she whispered to herself, pulling the blanket tighter. Old houses had pests. But as she lay there, heart pounding in the oppressive quiet, the scratches didn't sound random. They formed a distinct, repeating pattern against the plaster. Scratch, 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 scratch. 3 long, 2 short, over and over. Like a code tapping out from the darkness next door. The initial unsettling chill left by Agatha Varma's decree didn't dissipate with the morning sun. Instead, it settled like a permanent layer of frost over their newfound sanctuary. Sarah and Ben tried to shake it off, attributing it to the eccentricities of an elderly, possibly lonely neighbor. They resumed their unpacking with determined cheerfulness. But a new layer of self-consciousness had been added to every scrape of furniture, every dropped box, every burst of laughter. They found themselves instinctively lowering their voices as the afternoon light began to slant long and golden across the lawn, casting the Victorian house next door into even deeper, more impenetrable shadow. Sundown became less a natural phenomenon and more a looming curfew, a line drawn in the gathering dusk they instinctively feared to cross. Life attempted to find its rhythm. Ben, an inveterate musician whose fingers itched for strings, cautiously unpacked his beloved acoustic guitar. Music was his solace, his way of unwinding after years of grueling work that had funded this house. That first evening, precisely at 7:55 p.m., he sat on their new living room floor amidst towers of half-emptied boxes, the guitar resting comfortably on his knee. He strummed a few tentative chords, the warm, resonant notes filling the room, chasing away some of the oppressive silence that seemed to seep from the shared wall. He played softly, barely above a whisper. A gentle folk melody meant only for Sarah's ears as she sorted books nearby. It was a sound of normalcy, of home. At 8:01 p.m., the fragile peace shattered, not with a doorbell, but with a thunderous, violent pounding that shook their front door on its hinges. Boom, boom, boom. It wasn't knocking. It was an assault. Sarah jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. Ben froze, mid-chord, the note dying abruptly in the sudden, charged silence, before either could react. A guttural shriek tore through the wood, sharp and venomous. Silence. The voice was unmistakably Agatha's, but warped by a fury that seemed far too potent for her frail frame. I warned you. No noise after sundown. Silence. Ben scrambled up, setting the guitar aside carefully, his face a mixture of shock and burgeoning anger. Sarah followed him to the door, her hand instinctively clutching his arm. He opened it a crack, the chain lock firmly engaged. Agatha Varma stood on their porch, illuminated by the weak yellow glow of their porch light. She wasn't wearing the faded housecoat now, but a long, dark dress that seemed to absorb the light. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, her eyes wide and blazing with an intensity that bordered on madness. The veins stood out on her thin neck. Her fists were clenched at her sides, trembling. We were barely playing, Ben started, his voice tight with controlled frustration. It's only just past 8. Silence. She shrieked again, spittle flying from her thin lips. Her dark eyes, reflecting the porch light like chips of obsidian, locked onto his. You heard me. No noise, ever. Or you will regret it. You have no respect. Her gaze swept past Ben, pinning Sarah with the same unnerving hostility. None, Walla. She spat the Tagalog word, like a curse. Before they could form a response, she spun around with that same unnatural stiffness and stalked back across her own lawn, vanishing into the black rectangle of her doorway. The silence that followed was heavier than before, thick with threat and the echo of her fury. The next few days were lived under siege. They tiptoed, they whispered after dusk, they flinched at the sound of their own plumbing, the creak of a floorboard. The television stayed muted, its subtitles glowing in the dark living room. Agatha's presence was a constant, unseen pressure. They caught glimpses of her at her windows, a pale smudge behind grimy glass, watching, always watching. The hopeful atmosphere of their new home curdled into a tense vigilance. Ben's guitar remained in its case, a symbol of the freedom they'd lost. Sarah found herself jumping at the settling noises of the old house, her nerves frayed. Then came the morning with Mittens. Their plump, ginger tabby was an indoor-outdoor cat, accustomed to the freedom of their old apartment balcony. Here, they'd reluctantly allowed him supervised exploration of the fenced backyard. That Tuesday, Sarah called for him, as usual, for his breakfast. No answering meow, no familiar thud as he jumped down from a favorite nap spot. A cold dread began to pool in her stomach. She searched the house frantically, calling his name, her voice rising with panic. Ben joined her, checking under beds and in closets. Nothing. Steeling herself, Sarah stepped out onto the back porch, scanning the dewladen grass. Her eyes swept across the yard, then froze. There, nailed squarely to the center of their weathered wooden porch step, was Mittens' bright blue collar. Not placed, not dropped, nailed. A thick, rusty roofing nail had been driven straight through the plastic buckle, pinning the collar firmly to the wood. Beside it lay a small, folded square of yellowed paper. Sarah's hands trembled as she approached, Ben close behind her, his face pale. She had to crouch and tug hard to pull the note free from under the nailhead. It was written in a spidery, uneven hand, with thick, black ink that smelled faintly metallic. The message was chillingly simple. He meowed. "Keep him quiet, or I will." Sarah's breath hitched. A strangled sob escaped her. "Mittens," she whispered, her eyes darting wildly around the empty yard, imagining horrors. Ben's jaw clenched, his fists balling at his sides. The violation was profound, the threat unmistakable. This wasn't just about noise anymore. It was cruelty, a deliberate act of intimidation aimed at something they loved. Fury warred with fear inside Sarah. She couldn't let this stand, not this. Gripping the crumpled note, she marched across the damp grass towards Agatha's house. Ben, calling her name in a warning tone, she ignored. She hammered on the peeling paint of Agatha's back door, the sound echoing in the still morning air. "Agatha, Agatha Varma, open this door. What have you done with our cat? Open up." The door creaked open slowly, revealing only a sliver of the dim interior and Agatha's gaunt face. Her expression wasn't angry this time. It was calm. Almost, satisfied. Her dark eyes fixed on Sarah's tear-streaked face, then dropped to the note clutched in her white-knuckled hand. A slow, deliberate smile spread across Agatha's thin lips. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was a predator's smile, thin and cruel. And as her lips parted, Sarah saw them clearly. Rows of small, uneven teeth, stained a deep, rotten black. The sight was grotesque, unnatural. Agatha leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a rasping whisper that carried the scent of decay. "You'll learn respect, Enoch," she hissed, the unfamiliar Tagalog word sounding like a curse, one way or another. Before Sarah could react, the door slammed shut in her face with finality, leaving her standing on the weed-choked path. Clutching the threatening note, the image of those blackened teeth, and the chilling promise burning into her mind. Mittens was gone. And the rules of silence had just become a terrifying battle for survival. The silence in the wake of Mittens' disappearance wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating, charged with a dread that seeped into the very plaster of their new home. Sarah moved through the rooms like a ghost, her eyes perpetually drawn to the shared wall with Agatha's Victorian monstrosity. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the old plumbing, sounded amplified, a potential transgression waiting to be punished. Ben tried to maintain a facade of pragmatism, suggesting Mittens might have just wandered off, gotten spooked, maybe found a cozy shed elsewhere. But the image of the blue collar nailed to the step, the cruel note, and especially Agatha's blackened teeth and chilling promise, "You'll learn respect," one way or another, haunted Sarah. Respect felt synonymous with terror. It started subtly, a few days later, when the sharp autumn air outside couldn't quite mask a new, underlying scent inside their house. At first, Sarah dismissed it as the lingering smell of unpacked boxes, maybe damp cardboard, or perhaps something forgotten in the move. But it deepened, ripening into something unmistakably organic and foul. It wasn't garbage. It was the thick, cloying stench of rotting meat, the kind that clings to the back of the throat. Mixed with it was another odor, acrid and unsettling, the sharp, unmistakable reek of burnt hair. It seemed strongest near the shared wall in the living room and their bedroom hallway. A noxious miasma that no amount of open windows or scented candles could dispel. It ebbed and flowed, sometimes fading to a faint, sickly sweetness, other times intensifying, until Sarah felt physically nauseous, her eyes watering. Ben smelled it too, his face tightening with disgust and unease whenever he walked into a room. "It's coming from her side," Sarah whispered one evening, huddled on the sofa under a blanket despite the heating being on, like something's decomposing in the walls. Ben, trying to focus on a muted football game, just nodded grimly, his knuckles white on the remote. The scratching returned, but changed. It was no longer the distinct, almost rhythmic, 3 long, 2 short pattern of the first night. Now, it was sporadic, skittering, frantic. Sometimes it was a faint, persistent scritching, like tiny claws whirring at plaster deep within the wall cavities. Other times, it erupted into furious scrapes, loud enough to make them both jump, sounding as if something was trying desperately to dig its way through from the other side. It seemed to follow them, in the kitchen, making coffee, a frantic scrabbling behind the baseboards, trying to read in the living room, a slow, deliberate drag along the shared wall near the ceiling, lying awake in bed, a persistent, maddening scratch directly behind the headboard, vibrating through the pillow. Sleep became a fractured, elusive thing. Sarah started wearing earplugs, but the vibrations still reached her, a tactile horror that set her teeth on edge. One afternoon, driven by a desperate need to prove the sounds weren't just rats or their frayed nerves, Ben decided to investigate the air vents. The old house had floor vents covered with ornate, dusty grills. He pried one up in the hallway, the metal cold under his fingers. Shining his phone flashlight down into the dark, cobwebbed duct, he expected dust bunnies, maybe a dead insect. What he saw made him recoil, dropping the flashlight with a clatter. Deep grooves, fresh and raw, scored the sheet metal deep inside the duct. Not the random marks of rodent teeth, but parallel gouges, spaced like claws. Large claws had raked the metal with tremendous force, tearing through the thin aluminum from the inside. Sarah, he called, his voice strained. Look at this. She peered in, the beam of the recovered flashlight trembling in her hand. The claw marks weren't just on the bottom. They marred the sides of the ductwork, disappearing into the darkness, towards the shared wall, towards Agatha's house. The implication was horrifying. Something wasn't just in the walls. It was moving through the infrastructure of their home, something far larger and more vicious than any rat. The dread coalesced into outright terror late one night. Sarah, lying rigidly awake beside the softly snoring Ben, heard it. Not scratching, not the house settling, a voice, low, guttural, muffled by the thick plaster and lath, but undeniably coming from the direction of Agatha's house. It was chanting. The rhythm was hypnotic, repetitive, the words incomprehensible at first, flowing in a language that sounded harsh and unfamiliar. Sarah held her breath, straining to listen, her blood running cold. The chant rose and fell, sometimes dropping to a whisper, other times swelling with a fervent intensity that vibrated through the wall. And then, a phrase became clearer, repeated like a dark mantra. Ang mehea dinalaseoi gutom. Angamare dinalase I gutom. The words meant nothing to her, but the cadence, the raw, almost hungry emphasis on the last syllable, filled her with primal fear. She fumbled for her phone, opening a translation app, her fingers clumsy with terror. She typed the phonetic sounds as best she could. Ang magad, dinala koi guto. The result flashed on the screen. Stark white letters in the darkness. Those I brought are hungry. A choked whimper escaped Sarah's lips. Brought where? Hungry, for what? The implications were monstrous. The scratching, the smells. It wasn't neglect, it was feeding. Agatha wasn't just a grumpy old woman. She was a keeper of something unspeakable. Desperate for any shred of evidence, any proof they weren't losing their minds. Ben installed a small, discreet security camera in their living room the next day. It pointed towards the hallway and the front door, but its wide-angle lens also captured part of the shared wall. It was a gesture of defiance, a way to catch Agatha if she trespassed. Or perhaps capture the source of the noises. The first night, it recorded the mundane. Ben pacing, Sarah curled on the sofa, the flicker of the muted TV. Then, as the digital clock on the camera feed ticked over to 12 a.m., the image dissolved. Not into darkness, but into furious, rolling static. Like an old TV tuned to a dead channel. It lasted until exactly 3:07 a.m., then snapped back to a perfectly clear image of their empty, silent living room. Ben replayed the footage, his face ashen. It's like something jammed it, he muttered, a tremor in his voice, or flooded it with interference. The camera, their technological sentry, was useless during the witching hours. The final violation happened in the deepest part of that same night. Exhausted but unable to sleep, Sarah stared at the ceiling, listening to the now familiar static hum of dread. Then, above her, directly over their bed in the attic space of their single-story bungalow, came the distinct sound of footsteps. Not the scampering of an animal. Not the settling of old timber. Footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate, thud, 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 drag. As if something large, something cumbersome, was pacing the length of the attic floor directly above where they lay. Sarah froze, her hand flying to Ben's arm, nails digging in. He was awake instantly, his eyes wide in the gloom, listening. Thud, thud. The sound moved from one end of the room to the other, paused, then started back. It was impossible. Their attic was a cramped, unfinished space, accessed only by a pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling, which was securely latched, and Agatha lived alone. Alone in her decaying mansion filled with rot, and chance, and hungry things that scratched from within their walls and walked the empty space above their heads in the dead of night. The silence that eventually fell was worse than the footsteps. It was the silence of something listening back. The hollow ache left by Mitten's absence became a permanent fixture in 412 Maple Street. A silent, accusing presence that amplified every other unsettling nuance of their new existence. The cheerful potential Sarah had felt upon arrival had curdled, replaced by a suffocating vigilance that made the very air feel thick and charged. Agatha Varma's decaying Victorian wasn't just an eyesore next door. It had become a festering wound, leaking malignancy into their sanctuary. Sarah found herself navigating rooms with the cautious steps of an intruder, her gaze perpetually snagged by the shared wall, a thin, treacherous barrier against an incomprehensible darkness. Ben's attempts at reassurance, suggesting Mittens might have simply found a new territory, rang hollow against the visceral memory of the nailed collar, the spidery threat, and Agatha's predatory smile revealing those unnaturally blackened teeth. Her chilling promise, "You'll learn respect, one way or another," wasn't a warning. It felt like a sentence passed in a court of shadows. A few days after the confrontation, the atmosphere inside their home began to shift in a profoundly disturbing way. It started subtly, an underlying note beneath the usual sense of fresh paint, cardboard, and their own unpacked lives. At first, Sarah attributed it to the old house settling, perhaps dampness in the basement, or a forgotten bag of groceries misplaced during the move. But the scent deepened, ripening with alarming speed into something unmistakably organic and revolting. It was the thick, cloying stench of rotting meat, the kind that clings to the sinuses and coats the tongue, heavy with the promise of decay. Intertwined with it was a sharper, more acrid odor, the unmistakable, greasy reek of burnt hair, triggering primal revulsion. It seemed to emanate most strongly from the vicinity of the shared wall in the living room and along the hallway leading to their bedroom. A noxious miasma that defied open windows and aggressively scented candles. It pulsed, sometimes fading to a sickly sweet whisper that teased the nostrils, only to surge back with suffocating intensity. Forcing Sarah to cover her mouth, her eyes watering, stomach churning, Ben confirmed it wasn't her imagination. His face would tighten with disgust the moment he walked through the front door after work, his shoulders hunching as if physically repelled. "It's coming through," Sarah whispered one evening, huddled under a blanket on the sofa despite the thermostat's steady hum. Her eyes fixed on the innocuous-looking plaster, like something's rotting inside the walls. On her side, Ben, staring blankly at the muted television, could only nod, the grim set of his jaw speaking volumes. The scratching returned, but it was different now. Gone was the almost deliberate, coded rhythm of three long, too short, that had haunted their first night. This was chaotic, frantic, imbued with a desperate, skittering energy. Sometimes it was a faint, persistent, scritching, like dozens of tiny, frantic claws whirring incessantly at the deep lath and plaster, a sound that burrowed into the skull. Other times, it erupted into violent, furious scrapes, loud enough to make them both jump, sounding as if something large and determined was trying to claw its way through the barrier from the other side. It seemed less like an attempt to communicate, and more like an attempt to escape, or invade. The sounds were unnervingly mobile, while Sarah stood blearily making coffee in the pre-dawn gloom. A frantic scrabbling erupted from behind the kitchen baseboards, seeming to chase her feet. trying to lose herself in a book on the living room sofa. A slow, deliberate drag scrape resonated along the shared wall near the ceiling, as if something heavy was being pulled overhead. Worst of all were the nights. Lying rigidly awake in the oppressive silence of their bedroom, the darkness pressing in, the scratching would start directly behind the headboard. A persistent, maddening scratch that vibrated through the wood and into Sarah's pillow, setting her teeth on edge. Sleep became a fractured, elusive commodity. Sarah resorted to foam earplugs, but they couldn't block the vibrations. The tactile confirmation that the horror wasn't just auditory, but physical, pressing in on them. The oppressive silence following the attic footsteps wasn't empty. It was thick with the residue of violation, a chilling confirmation that the boundaries of their home, of reality itself, were porous. Sarah and Ben existed in a state of perpetual, low-grade terror, jumping at shadows, flinching at the house's ordinary groans. Their nerves scraped raw. The shared wall felt less like a divider and more like a membrane, permeable to Agatha Varma's malignant influence. The phantom odors of decay, the maddening scratches, the guttural chants promising hunger, and now, the impossible weight pacing above them. Sleep was a battleground they rarely won. Ben, driven by a desperate need to understand, to see the enemy, became fixated on the Victorian house next door. His rational engineer's mind, frayed but not yet broken, sought patterns, vulnerabilities, anything he could document or explain. He spent hours peering through gaps in their curtains, binoculars often in hand, scanning the shuttered windows, the overgrown yard, the decaying porch, searching for any sign of Agatha or the source of the horrors bleeding into their lives. It was during one of these tense vigils, late one frigid night, when frost was beginning to lace the window panes, that Ben noticed it. A light, not from the upper floors shrouded in perpetual gloom, nor from the porch swallowed by shadows. This light emanated from below ground level, a single, small basement window, partially obscured by years of grime and encroaching weeds. And it wasn't the warm yellow of an ordinary bulb. It was a deep, pulsing crimson, like a banked coal or diluted blood glowing in the dark. It flickered rhythmically, casting erratic, bloody shadows on the frost-whitened grass directly outside the window. Well, it appeared precisely at midnight, as if triggered by some infernal clock, and vanished just before dawn. Night after night, the ritual repeated. The crimson glow became a beacon of dread, a silent announcement that Agatha's nocturnal activities were reaching their peak. Ben didn't share his discovery with Sarah immediately. She was already stretched so thin. Her eyes haunted, her sleep fractured by nightmares, both waking and sleeping. He watched the light alone, a knot of cold dread tightening in his stomach each time it appeared. What required such a light? What was she doing down there in that blood-red gloom? The rhythmic pulsing seemed to sync with the scratching sounds that now plagued them almost constantly, a dark counterpoint that made his skin crawl. He remembered the claw marks in the ductwork, the size and savagery of them. The translation, "Those I brought are hungry." The crimson light felt like a hearth in a monster's den. Curiosity, a dangerous cousin to dread, began to gnaw at him. He had to see. He needed proof, not just for the authorities they both knew would dismiss them, but for his own sanity. He needed to know what they were truly up against. The fence separating their properties was old, wooden, and rotting in sections. He knew of a spot near the back, partially shielded by a dense, overgrown forsythia bush, where several slats were loose or missing, offering a narrow oblique view towards the side of Agatha's house, where the basement window glowed. It was risky, madness even, but the compulsion was overwhelming. One night, when the air was bitingly cold and the crimson light pulsed with its usual eerie regularity, Ben made his move. Sarah, exhausted, had finally fallen into a fitful sleep. Moving with the silent care of a burglar, Ben slipped out the back door, the cold air hitting him like a physical blow. He crept across their frosted lawn, his breath pluming in the still air. Every crunch of frozen grass under his boots sounding impossibly loud in the dead silence. Reaching the dense cover of the forsythia, its bare branches like skeletal fingers, he dropped to his hands and knees. The frozen earth bit through his jeans. He could smell damp soil and the faint, ever-present undercurrent of decay emanating from the Victorian. Carefully, silently, he peered through the gap in the fence slats. His view was limited and distorted, angled sharply towards the foundation of Agatha's house. But there it was, the source of the crimson glow. The basement window was slightly clearer from this vantage point, though still filthy. The light pulsed from within, illuminating the cramped, dirt-floored space beyond the glass in stark, bloody chiaroscuro, and there, silhouetted against the hellish glow, stood Agatha Varma. She wasn't pacing or chanting. She stood rigidly, facing away from him, towards a large, dark shape in the center of the cramped space that the window's frame only partially revealed. It looked like a pit. A crude, circular depression sunk into the bare earth floor, roughly lined with uneven chunks of concrete and crumbling brick. The edges were stained dark, almost black in the crimson light. Agatha held something large and heavy in her arms. A lumpy, dripping bundle wrapped in stained burlap. With a sudden, jerky movement, she heaved the bundle forward, dropping it into the center of the pit. Ben held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, movement. Something erupted from the shadows within the pit, coiling upwards with unnatural speed. Ben caught a horrifying glimpse. A limb, thick and sinuous, covered not in fur or skin, but in overlapping dark scales that glistened wetly in the pulsing red light. It ended, not in a hand or paw, but in a cluster of long, chitinous talons, curved like sickles. The scaled limb snatched the burlap bundle from the air before it even hit the pit floor, yanking it down into the darkness with terrifying strength. A sound followed. A wet, tearing noise, horrifyingly loud, even muffled by the window and the distance, mixed with a low guttural hiss that vibrated through the frozen ground beneath Ben's knees. It was the sound of rending meat, of primal consumption. The stench of decay wasn't just next door anymore. It invaded their home with brutal force. Overnight, Sarah's cherished peace lily, a vibrant green sentinel on the kitchen windowsill, withered into a blackened, slimy husk. Her thriving spider plant, hanging near the shared wall, followed, leaves curling and rotting as if doused in acid. The pervasive smell of rot intensified, thick and gagging. Then came the flies. Not a few curious buzzers, but a seething, black cloud erupting seemingly from the walls themselves, coating surfaces in a living, crawling carpet. They clustered thickest near the shared wall, a vibrating mass drawn to an unseen source of corruption. Swatting was futile. They returned instantly, their incessant drone filling the air, a maddening counterpoint to the ever-present scratching. Their home wasn't just haunted. It was dying, being consumed from within by Agatha's invisible plague. Desperation overrode fear. While Ben battled the flies with a vacuum cleaner, roaring like a futile exorcism, Sarah retreated to their bedroom. The door shut against the worst of the swarm. The glow of her laptop screen was a small island of light in the suffocating dread. Her fingers, sticky from swatting insects, flew across the keyboard. Agatha Varma, Maple Street, disappearances, history. Local newspaper archives yielded a chilling headline from 1978. Varma family vanishes without trace. The accompanying photo showed a much younger Agatha, her face already etched with severity, standing rigidly beside a stern man and two unsmiling children. The caption confirmed it. Her husband and kids. But it was another photo, buried deeper in the digital archive. A grainy evidence shot that stopped Sarah's breath. It showed a small, crude object found at the scene, a bone carving. Zooming in, Sarah recoiled. It depicted a small, malevolent figure wreathed in stylized flames, its eyes mere pits, its mouth a rictus grin. The caption identified it. San Telmo carving, traditional Philippine folk belief, associated with fire demons or lost souls. Former neighbors quoted in the article were sparse but damning, kept to herself. Strange noises, ... always muttering, ... Folks said she fed something. The words echoed Agatha. Isa chant? Ang minga. Dinala kwai gutam. She didn't just keep pets, she kept demons. And she fed them. That evening, retreating from the fly-blown kitchen, after another silent, oppressive meal, Sarah found it on their porch step. A chipped, floral-patterned plate, the kind from a thrift store. On it, congealed into a foul, dark brown mass, studded with globules of white fat, lay a portion of deniguin, the traditional Filipino blood stew. It reeked of iron and spoiled meat, worse than the decay in their walls. Flies swarmed it greedily. But as Sarah stared, repulsed, the flies lifted momentarily in a shifting cloud. Revealing words spelled out in the thick, clotting surface. Salamat. Thank you, Ben, appearing behind her, gagged. Is this an apology? Some twisted peace offering? Sarah couldn't speak. The rancid stew wasn't protection, it was a receipt. Payment received. For the silence, for the cat, or for the hunger she now knew festered next door, waiting for its next meal. The flies settled back, obscuring the word, feasting on the demon's leftovers. The rancid stench of the deniguin offering clung to the porch air long after Ben, gagging, had disposed of the plate deep in the outside trash bin, sealing the lid with grim finality. Yet, the foulness felt secondary now, a mere symptom of the deeper, more pervasive corruption seeping from next door. The word salamat, spelled in flies on congealed blood stew, echoed in Sarah's mind. Not gratitude, but a chilling acknowledgement, a ledger marked. Agatha knew they knew. The fragile, terrified equilibrium they'd maintained, tiptoeing through their own decaying home, shattered completely. They existed in a state of suspended dread, jumping at every creak. Every intensified wave of the rotting meat stench that now seemed to pulse from the walls, synchronized with the frantic, unseen clawing. Ben's arm, where the basement creature's talons had grazed his psyche more than his flesh, throbbed with a phantom ache whenever the crimson light pulsed next door. They barely spoke, communicating in shared, terrified glances, trapped in a silent nightmare with no escape route visible. The invitation arrived 3 days after the offering, not slipped under the door during the vulnerable static hours, but placed squarely in the center of their grimy welcome mat in broad gray daylight. It was a single sheet of thick, yellowed parchment, brittle at the edges, smelling faintly of dust, mildew, and something vaguely sweet yet nauseating, like decayed flowers. The handwriting was the same spidery black script as the note about mittens, but the ink looked darker, older, almost burnt. It bore no salutation, only a stark command. Come tonight. Apologize for your noise. Sundown, my door. Below, scrawled with the finality that felt like a judge's signature, Avarma, Holding the parchment made Sarah's fingers tingle unpleasantly, a low-grade electric buzz that raised the hairs on her arm. Ben stared at it, his face pale. "This is it," he whispered, the words scraping out. "The trap. She's done playing neighbor." Sarah's instinct screamed, "Run. Pack the car, drive, never look back." But the image of Mitten's collar, the impossible footsteps above their bed, the scaled limb in the crimson pit, the word Salamat, they painted a horrifying picture. Agatha wasn't confined by walls or property lines. Running felt futile, like trying to escape a spreading stain. And beneath the terror, a desperate, hopeless ember flickered. Maybe if we apologize. Maybe if we show respect. She lift this curse. Maybe we can get our lives back. Sundown arrived, bleeding the last gray light from the sky. Maple Street felt unnaturally still, holding its breath. They stood on their own porch, staring across the few yards of neglected lawn at the Victorian's hulking silhouette. No lights shone within, not even the usual crimson pulse from the basement. It was a maw of absolute darkness. Agatha's front door, a massive slab of scarred wood, stood slightly ajar. Just a sliver of deeper blackness, an open grave inviting them in. Crossing that threshold was the hardest thing Sarah had ever done. The air that rushed out to meet them was frigid, thick, and saturated with the now familiar reek of decay. Rotting meat, burnt hair, damp earth, but amplified tenfold, layered with older stenches. Dust undisturbed for decades, moldering fabric, and beneath it all, a coppery temps like old blood. The silence inside was profound, a physical pressure against their eardrums after the faint suburban hum outside. Ben clicked on his powerful flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating swirling dust motes and a grand foyer choked with neglect. Cobwebs draped rotting chandeliers like funeral shrouds. Tattered, dark wallpaper peeled in long strips, revealing crumbling plaster beneath. Furniture lay shrouded in stained moth-eaten sheets, their shapes indistinct and menacing in the periphery. "Mrs. Varma." Ben called out, his voice swallowed by the oppressive stillness. Only the faintest echo answered. The beam of light trembled slightly in his hand. Then, movement. Not Agatha. Shadows. Along the walls of the grand, decaying hallway leading deeper into the house, the shadows seemed to writhe. Not cast by the flashlight beam, but independent, alive. They coiled like smoke, stretched into impossibly elongated shapes that skittered just beyond the edge of the light, retreating as the beam swept towards them. A low, collective sigh seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a sound of dry leaves and distant, pained whispers. Sarah grabbed Ben's arm, her nails digging in. The flashlight beam darted erratically, catching glimpses of the shadow things recoiling, merging with the deeper darkness of doorways. A floorboard creaked above them. They froze, hearts hammering. Slowly, deliberately, Agatha descended the grand staircase. She wasn't wearing the housecoat or the dark dress, but a garment that looked woven from shadows themselves. A long, shapeless robe of deepest black that seemed to absorb the flashlight beam. Her gaunt face was impassive, her dark eyes reflecting the light like chips of obsidian, devoid of any emotion except perhaps a cold expectancy. She didn't speak, merely stared at them for a long, terrifying moment. Then, she turned and glided soundlessly down the hallway, away from the front door, deeper into the heart of the decaying mansion. She didn't look back. The command was implicit. Follow. Every instinct screamed no. But the alternative, staying alone in that foyer with the living shadows, was unthinkable. Exchanging a look of pure, shared terror, they followed the frail, black-robed figure, their flashlight beam a desperate, bobbing lifeline in the suffocating darkness. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever. Doors standing open to reveal glimpses of decaying parlors filled with shrouded shapes. A dining room with a table set with tarnished, bone-handled cutlery under decades of dust. The smell intensified, the coppery temps growing stronger, mixed with the sickly sweet decay. The whispering shadows thickened along the walls, seeming to press closer as they walked. Agatha stopped before a heavy iron-bound door set low in the wall at the end of the hall. It looked ancient, out of place in the Victorian architecture. A cold draft seeped from beneath it, carrying the overwhelming scent of damp earth, raw meat, and something reptilian, musky. Agatha produced an old, blackened key and unlocked it. The hinges screamed in protest as she pulled it open, revealing a steep, narrow staircase plunging into utter blackness. The frigid air that rushed up was thick with the stench of the pit, now horrifyingly immediate. The crimson light Ben had witnessed from outside pulsed faintly from below, casting long bloody shadows up the stone steps. Agatha turned to them, her obsidian eyes glinting in the weak, hellish glow rising from the basement. Her thin lips peeled back in a semblance of a smile, revealing those blackened teeth. "Down," she rasped, the single word carrying the weight of a death sentence. "Apologize properly." Her gaze swept over them, cold and assessing. "My children," she crooned, her voice dropping to a guttural whisper filled with a terrible pride, "need new voices. Yours will do nicely. Quiet, at last." She gestured with a skeletal hand towards the yawning darkness of the stairwell. The invitation had expired. The audience with the keeper of the pit had begun. And the price of admission was their silence forever. The frantic, screeching chaos of Agatha's final moments, the wet tearing, the guttural shrieks abruptly silenced, echoed in Sarah's skull long after the physical sounds faded. She half-dragged, half-carried Ben up the basement stairs, his arm slick with blood where a talon had ripped through his jacket and flesh, his face ashen with shock and pain. The oppressive silence of the Victorian house felt different now, not watchful, but sated. The living shadows on the walls seemed to coil languidly, retreating into corners like well-fed serpents. They stumbled through the decaying foyer, past the shrouded furniture that now felt like silent witnesses to the horror below, and burst out into the blessedly cold, open air of Maple Street. They didn't stop running until they slammed their own front door shut, locking every lock, pushing furniture against it in a frenzy of primal defense. They huddled together on the living room floor, surrounded by the lingering stench of decay and flies. Ben's arm hastily bandaged with kitchen towels already blooming red. Shivering not just from cold but from the bone-deep terror of what they'd witnessed, Agatha was gone, dragged into the pit by the very horrors she'd fed, but the silence they craved. It felt heavier, more charged than ever. The police arrived in the gray light of dawn, summoned by their frantic, near-incoherent 911 call. Two officers, faces etched with skepticism and the weariness of a night shift, listened to their stammering account. The grumpy neighbor, the basement, the pit, the creatures, the attack. They spoke of Agatha Varma being pulled into the darkness. Ben showed his savaged arm, the deep, parallel gouges, clearly not made by any human implement. Sarah's haunted eyes and trembling hands lent a fragile credibility. The officers exchanged a look. They investigated Agatha's house, emerging hours later looking bored and faintly disgusted. "Basement's empty," the senior officer reported, wiping dust from his hands onto his trousers. "Just junk. Old furniture, boxes, some gardening tools. No pit, no creatures." He glanced at Ben's bandaged arm. Looks like you tangled with something nasty. Son. Raccoon, maybe. Big one. Angry. He dismissed the gouges in the air duct as old damage, probably rodents. Agatha's disappearance. Lived alone, frail. Probably fell down her own stairs in the dark. Place is a death trap. We'll file it as accidental death pending further investigation. But, he shrugged, his meaning clear. Case closed. Crazy people. They left with platitudes about getting Ben's arm properly stitched, and maybe talking to someone about the stress of moving. The official narrative was neat, clean, and utterly, terrifyingly wrong. Sarah and Ben knew the truth. The pit hadn't been an illusion. The creatures weren't raccoons. Agatha Varma hadn't tripped. She'd been consumed by the hungry things she'd bound to her will, things that dwelled in a space the police couldn't, or wouldn't, see. Relief at her demise was overshadowed by a chilling new reality. The keeper was gone, but the things remained, unbound, unfed. And their home was still irrevocably tied to that malignant place next door. The house itself seemed to breathe a sigh of anticipation. The pervasive stench of decay faded slightly, replaced by a dry, dusty smell, like an ancient tomb disturbed. The frantic scratching stopped, but it wasn't replaced by peace. It was replaced by a deeper, more profound silence, broken only by the sounds of their own fearful movements. And then, the whispers began. Not Agatha's guttural chants, but her voice. Thin, reedy, impossibly close, filtering through the air vents, late at night, when the world outside was utterly still. So much noise. It would sigh, a breath of icy air against Sarah's ear, as she lay rigid in bed. Always. So much noise. It wasn't a threat. It was an observation, laden with a terrible, weary malevolence. The distinct pattern of scratching, 3 long, 2 short, returned, not frantic, but deliberate. A chillingly familiar tap-tap, tapping against the shared wall, usually around 3 a.m., the hour of the dead. A grim reminder of where it all began. They lived like ghosts in their own home. Sleep was impossible. Every creak, every sigh of the old building felt like a prelude to something worse. Ben's arm healed slowly, the deep scratches leaving angry, puckered scars that seemed unnaturally cold to the touch. But it was the cough that started a week after the basement incident that truly terrified Sarah. It was a dry, rasping hack, deep in his chest. At first, she blamed dust, stress, the lingering foulness in the air, but it worsened. The rasp deepened, taking on a wet, gurgling undertone. And sometimes, just sometimes, especially when the cough was particularly violent, or when he was asleep, it sounded less like a human cough and more like a low, sibilant hiss. It was the sound Sarah remembered from the pit, muffled by earth and concrete but chillingly similar. Ben dismissed it, blaming a chest infection, but the fear in his eyes mirrored her own. Had something entered him in that basement scuffle? Something more than just a wound. The final confirmation came last Tuesday. Sarah, sleepless again, had ventured into the kitchen at dawn for water. She opened the back door, seeking a gasp of fresh air to clear the perpetual tomb dust smell. There, centered precisely on the worn wooden porch step, the same step where Mitten's collar had been nailed, sat a familiar chipped floral plate. On it, congealed into a foul, dark jelly, was a portion of Deniguin. The rancid stench of old blood and fat hit her like a physical blow. Flies, sluggish, in the cool morning air, crawled over its surface. But as Sarah stared, frozen in horror, the flies lifted in a cloud, disturbed by her presence, etched into the surface of the clotting stew. Not spelled by the insects this time, but carved or congealed into the substance itself, was a single word. Salamat, thank you. It wasn't from Agatha. It was from the things. A receipt, acknowledgement, perhaps even an invitation for more. They're moving tomorrow. Boxes are haphazardly packed, filled not with hope but with desperate flight. The house on Maple Street, their dream home, is being sold for a fraction of its worth, a cursed place they can't wait to abandon. As Sarah writes this, sealing the last box labeled Bedroom Essentials, Ben coughs violently in the next room. It starts as a dry hack, rattling deep in his chest, then catches, gurgling wetly. And as it subsides, it ends, not with a gasp, but with a distinct, drawn-out, reptilian hiss. The sound hangs in the air of the empty room, thick with the smell of dust, decay, and the faint, metallic temps of old blood. The silence that follows is absolute. The unquiet house holds its breath, listening. Sarah knows they're fleeing the house, but she doesn't know if they're fleeing what's inside Ben. The feast next door may be over, but the hunger, it seems, has found a new voice, and it's coming with them.